Hello and welcome to another edition of For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. My guest today is Cindy Bankoski, first timer on the show. She is the director of Learning House, and we welcome you to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
We've had someone on from the Learning House, I guess at least a couple of years ago. For those who did not catch that show, tell us about the Learning House. What is it?
Yes. Learning House was originally founded by Susan Santora. She is a fellow with the Academy of Orton Gillingham Practitioners and Educators. And she originally founded it in about 1983, and it began in her house where she was teaching dyslexic and struggling learners from her house and training teachers to also teach dyslexic and struggling learners. And we have been using an approach called the Orton Gillingham approach to do that, which is Susan's particular area of expertise. She was actually the one that you previously interviewed. In about the early 90s, the clinic that was running out of Susan's house ended up outgrowing Susan's location, and she purchased a facility in Guilford. That is our current location now. And she began to teach more students, was able to continue to train more teachers, and it's been running out of that location ever since. In about 2014, my husband and I purchased the business from Susan, and she has continued on to our happiness as our clinical advisor. So we continue to follow her mission and offer those services to families of dyslexic learners, as well as to continue to train teachers as well.
How did you and why did you want to get involved but with the purchase of the business? When something like this happens, usually it's somebody close to you that's involved, and so you have a vested interest in wanting to be involved in some way with it, right?
Yes, exactly. In about around 2008, my daughter really found herself in a fairly large crisis in her school. She was struggling to learn to read, and I was astonished at how little my team really knew about how to help her. And I had decided to do a lot of research into the particular areas that she was struggling with, and knew that our family had a history of dyslexia. And in my conversations with the school and in my research, tried to help them learn how best to help her and the types of things that she might need should she end up being a dyslexic student, which then she turned out to be.
So let's give somebody like a sort of a layperson's definition of what dyslexia is.
Okay. So from an official definition, and then we can sort of go back from there. The official definition of dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty, and that's in relation to a student's intelligence capabilities with the way that they process sounds and attribute those sounds to labels, letters in written language. And it can also include things like letter reversals, which is not that they're seeing letters backwards, but that they're processing that information differently than would be a typical reader. Also, they struggle many times with word retrieval issues. It's really a language processing difficulty that is at the root of dyslexia in students.
Dyslexia is one of those conditions that is greatly, I think, is greatly misunderstood as far as what people think dyslexia is. Would you agree?
That's true. That's true. And unfortunately, where we see that the effect of that the largest is within the educational environment. And unfortunately, that's really the most important place to be able to first recognize that a student is struggling with dyslexia, and it is the place where dyslexia must be remediated.
But the problem is that most educators they don't have a grasp on how to handle it for the most part?
Yes.
Or maybe even identify it or misidentify what a student's problem is when it turns out it's dyslexia.
All
right?
the above.
Yeah.
Really. It's found that dyslexia coexists with other conditions.
And then you might be treating the wrong thing.
That's correct. And really what we're talking about is adequate training of teachers to be able to recognize dyslexia in a student, and then to receive training that is the most appropriate for teaching dyslexic students. And there's a very large body of research that has been published that tells us exactly how we should be teaching dyslexic students to learn to read. The unfortunate situation we find ourselves in is that teaching universities have not taken up that research and incorporated it into education for teachers. One of the things that's changed since Learning House was last year with you is that there have been several parent advocacy groups that have gotten involved in legislative areas with regard to dyslexia. Groups such as Decoding Dyslexia Connecticut, and which is a grassroots parent-led legislative action group, as well as the Dyslexia Society of Connecticut, for which I've been recently appointed to the board.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so they have been able to bring about several much-needed changes, which will hopefully impact the lives of dyslexics. And one of the very first things they did was change the designation that a student could qualify for on their IEP, their individual education plan. Originally, dyslexic students were lumped into a category called SLD, Specific Learning Disability. And what that was a catch-all for students that had reading difficulties.
But not necessarily dyslexia.
Not necessarily dyslexia, although the research tells us that 80% of those students that qualify as SLD do meet the characteristics of dyslexia.
Yeah.
However, what would happen is the goals and objectives that were written for those students sometimes wouldn't have anything to do with what they specifically needed to remediate their reading difficulties. So fast forward about 3 years ago, and now students must be evaluated for the appropriateness of checking off the SLD dyslexia box. And therefore, if a student meets the criteria of that designation, the goals and objectives will now have to be specifically addressed at their individual areas of reading need.
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask you, when you discover that there is dyslexia, is it vary depending on the individual, and do they have to be sort of treated, may not be the right word, but do they have to be worked with on a very individual basis, or is there a sort of a blanket method for dealing with it or for teaching them? You know what I mean?
Yes, I
because
do.
different attributes can come out in an individual with dyslexia compared to the next person over, right?
That's true. It's a very good question. Dyslexia actually exists on a continuum, much like many of the other disabilities out there. You can have a mild dyslexic, and it can range all the way up to very severe dyslexia. And so we don't alter the approach that we take in teaching the dyslexic students. We still follow the time-tested principles based on our Orton-Gillingham approach, multisensory, explicit, direct language-based instruction that's individualized to the needs of that student. But where we might vary it would be in the amount of pacing or reinforcement that a particular student who may be a more severe dyslexic may need. So, for example, a more severe dyslexic, we may need to continue to reinforce a skill more than once or in more than one way in order for them to master that before we can move on.
Yeah, it's a matter of seeing the results, right?
Right.
In front of you.
It's all based on the student's success with the skill that we're teaching them, and we follow an OG scope and sequence that's been developed for years and utilized by Orton-Gillingham practitioners. And we teach the most common skills in the English language first, and that way the students are receiving, demonstrating mastery with the skills that they're going to come in contact with most common more frequently. And then we work through that scope and sequence and eventually work up to prefixes and suffixes and teaching them vocabulary through what we call morphology.
Are you basically creating like new neural pathways in the brain when you do that?
It's interesting because Samuel Orton, who is the founder, if you will, of Orton Gillingham, along with Anna Gillingham, knew that from a very long time ago that this approach would work with students. And in fact, research shows that due to neuroplasticity, the ability of neurons to form and adapt, what would have been a student who was attempting to read using inefficient neural pathways, it has been found and proven in research that we can improve those neural pathways by following this approach. And therefore, what would have previously looked like a dyslexic brain after our intervention, if you put that brain back through the same testing, the brain would look like a typical reader.
So you're not creating new neural pathways, you're just improving the ones that already exist there, right?
The theory is that you're making those pathways more efficient, and you could be building more pathways or really just helping the brain to be more efficient. And by more efficient, really, we're asking the brain to retrieve stored information more quickly in order to be able to read a word more accurately so that the student can then understand what they're reading.
And you had mentioned before that dyslexia can exist alongside other conditions, and then that makes it even that much more difficult, I guess, to make a diagnosis.
It can be. For us, really, the diagnosis isn't necessarily as important because, again, going back to the research would indicate that the type of approach that's necessary to teach a dyslexic student to read, that same approach can benefit all students, no matter what particular disability they may have. And even in typical readers who perhaps learned to read in a way other than the multisensory approach that we utilize, the studies have been shown to improve their reading proficiency as well. So all around, it's just a good quality reading approach that benefits all students, no matter what their difficulties or capabilities are.
Right. That's a good opportunity for us to take a break, and we'll have you give out the website so they can go and learn more. What is the website?
The website is www.learninghouse-ct.com.
Okay, and we'll put a graphic up on the screen too there for everybody to go. Cindy Benkoski, the director of Learning House. We're learning a lot, but we've got a lot more to get to, so we'll take a short break and come right back. I'm Sean Murphy. This is For the Record. Stay there. Welcome back to For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. Cindy Benkoski is my guest. She's director of Learning House, which is physically located in Guilford, right?
Yes.
But you have people coming in from Rhode Island and all over Connecticut. Your base of individuals who utilize your services are vast, right?
Yes. We're actually the only clinic in the state of Connecticut that's accredited by the Academy of Orton Gillingham Practitioners and Educators, and we're very proud of that, both for our clinic where we teach students using the Orton Gillingham approach, as well as for our teacher instruction program as well.
You know, the approach that you talk about, are there other methods that can be used for dyslexia too? But you really have your approach, but are there other methods?
There are other methods that have been developed that are based on the Orton Gillingham approach.
Okay.
But we are different in that through our accreditation by the Academy, we are actually directly supervised by our fellow, which we're happy to say is Susan Santora. And so part of our teaching program also includes the ability to do a practicum training model where we can train the teachers after they've taken our course to be able to carry out the scope and sequence of instruction with a dyslexic student under supervision. And it turns out that that is a very important characteristic of a good quality reading instruction plan. As I said, every dyslexic is different, and you can learn how to effectively teach one dyslexic, and then another dyslexic will sit in front of you, and you'll have to kind of pull out a whole new bag of tricks. And so it's good to have the supervision for that.
If you have someone, a student that before they come to you, have they already gone to like their general practitioner and been evaluated by them first, or is it something that can be identified directly in the school or even by the parent, and they say, you know what, I'm going to try the Learning House, or is there a medical path that has to be followed first?
Generally, people will approach their pediatricians. That is typically the advice given. Dyslexia is listed now in the new DSM. However, in my experience, the pediatricians are less able to identify dyslexia because it shows up mostly in school when students are asked to learn the sounds of letters and the language system for reading. So typically, the action does not come at the direction of a pediatrician. It generally shows up in school. Either the school notices it, or more often than not, the parent notices the student struggling, and typically will bring that to the attention of the school. And from there, the process becomes fairly complicated as to requesting the school to do an evaluation. And if the school doesn't do an evaluation, doesn't see that it's necessary, or the parent still chooses that they want to do an evaluation, then they can request an independent evaluation through the school. But one of the things that I would say is that becomes an incredibly complicated process.
It sounds it.
And my assistant, Marion, is a wealth of information with regard to how to navigate that process. It becomes very tricky because the parent obviously is upset and concerned about their child, and the school is trying to do the best that they can. So I would just advise people to call Learning House and ask us their questions, and we can do what we can to help them navigate that.
This is why training of the teachers is so important, isn't it?
That is, absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit more about the evaluation process in school. How training the teachers is obviously important for this, but what is the evaluation process, if you can describe that in maybe layman's terms too? That's not going to be easy.
It's not really an easy thing to evaluate. Usually it involves a basic evaluation of the student's intellectual capabilities and just a general psychoeducational battery. And a lot of times, I must say that that's where it ends. But what is at times left out is really a comprehensive reading evaluation in order to find out how the student is recognizing the sounds in language, which is incredibly important. It's the basis of reading proficiency, really, and how the student has mastered the ability to assign those sounds to letters, and really all the way through comprehension and vocabulary, and to be able to look at all of those things and compare them to the student's intellectual capabilities.
You had mentioned the growth of the Learning House from its humble beginnings to where it is now. And it's a good thing that you've grown in the sense that you can help more people. On the flip side, is it surprising or shocking to you that it just goes to show that there are that many people with dyslexia that need help or have since been identified with it? What are the numbers?
The numbers are 1 in 5. So recently we were at one of our dyslexia workshops, and we had a teacher who was really thinking about that number and really thinking about her class and trying to think about her class of 20 and which 4 of them could potentially be dyslexic.
Yeah, that's and then what do they do? What's the next step after that? Once they have an inkling that this may be the case, the best course of action should be for them.
The best course of action really should be that if a teacher suspects that a student may meet the characteristics of being dyslexic, a student will make a recommendation to, a teacher will make a recommendation to the school team, and the school team really should pursue an evaluation for that student to see if they meet the characteristics of dyslexia, and then to develop appropriate goals and objectives that target that student's specific area of reading intervention.
How young can you be and be identified as having dyslexia?
There's a shift in that as well. It used to be that many in the education profession thought that a dyslexic student could or would not be identified until around the age of grade 3, or until grade 3. And that's the point at which students go from learning to read to reading to learn. That's really the stop point. And for us, that has turned into really the last opportunity to identify them as being dyslexic. There will be research coming out very shortly by Dr. Bennett and Sally Shaywitz that really demonstrate the need to identify dyslexic students as early as first grade. This disability is another disability where early identification and early remediation is absolutely imperative. What happens to children if they are not identified until after the point at which they are reading to learn is that now they are in third grade, or unfortunately even older, where they know that they should be able to read, and they're feeling very badly about themselves. So we see many students who suffer anxiety and depression because they're old enough to know that they should be able to do something that their other classmates can do so easily. And this can be basically a snowball effect as you attempt to remediate their reading needs as they're now being expected to read to learn.
What is a success story for you? Turning it around completely so that dyslexia kind of doesn't exist in an individual? Is that possible?
It's not possible for dyslexia to go away,
Okay.
and that's a little bit of a myth. I think it is. I know that it is possible to teach dyslexics to learn to read. We do it successfully every day at Learning House, and I know that's possible to improve in the school system as well if we begin working with these children as early as first grade with an approach that's based in the principles that we have found so useful in Orton Gillingham.
Having the proper work, like what you at Learning House, can a person go through school? Can they get through it? Can they go to college and just live a regular life?
Yes, they can. Yes,
Okay.
they can. A lot of times what will happen is our dyslexic learners have some issues where they have processing speed. They may process information more slowly, but it doesn't mean that they process that information incorrectly. And that's to say that given enough time, a dyslexic student can be as successful or many times more successful than a typical student. And that's due to what Dr. Sally Shaywitz would indicate as the sea of strengths that exists alongside the deficit in reading that dyslexics struggle with in early grades. So many times they can be out-of-the-box thinkers. They, by virtue of their struggles and their difficulties, become extremely hard workers, and they're usually very creative-minded. And that lends them much success usually in adult years.
All right, let's take one more break and come right back. Cindy Benkowski is the director of Learning House, and we will take a break. I'm Sean Murphy. For the record, stay right here. So we are just about out of time. Want to get to a couple of more things before we do. You are still taking students for this summer. You don't have quite a full class yet, correct?
That's correct.
What do they have to do if they want to be involved?
Give a call to Learning House, and we'd be happy to get them set up to come.
All right, and you also have workshops from time to time. Basically, it's a dyslexia, I can't even say it. It's a simulation, right?
That's
so
right.
Tell us about that.
It's a dyslexia simulation that we're offering to allow participants the opportunity to experience what a dyslexic student would feel like in a classroom.
Okay.
And it's been very well received.
And you'll keep them coming, right? Keep
Yes.
going. All right. So one more time on the website for people to go and learn more, and if they have any questions, I'm sure it's loaded with information there, right?
Yes, our website is www.learninghouse.org. learninghouse-ct.com.
Don't worry, the graphic is correct. So there you go. We learned a lot today, too, from Cindy Benkoski, the director of Learning House, which is actually located in Guilford, but people are coming from all over Rhode Island, all over Connecticut. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You can see this show, by the way, and many others on our YouTube site. Till next time, I'm Sean Murphy. This is For the Record. Take care.